So the first thing we need to do is launch Visual Studio. So let's do that. If you don't know where to get Visual Studio from or how to install it, please see the previous video. It's a free application. It's obviously very important if you want to make C# or .NET projects. So check out the previous video. But once it's launched, we're going to create a new project. The type of project we want to make is called a console application. So you can search in this box here for different project templates. One we're looking for is the .NET Framework console app. And actually we want it to be C#. You'll see here that if you've got other languages installed, they'll show up as well. So we don't want any of those. We want console app, .NET Framework, C#. We'll select that and click next. We can give our project a name. I'm going to call mine Hello World User. You can also say where to save this on the location, so you can click in here and pick a folder and all that doodah. I'm just going to leave my default for now. You can set a solution name, which is not something we'll look at in this video, but later on we will cover that. You can pick a framework version. Again, this is all fine on default for now. Once you're ready, click Create. So now you've launched your first project, and this is what Visual Studio looks like whilst you're editing code and building programs. So let's just have a quick look around. So the center panel is the code window. So the code window works a bit like Chrome. If you click on a code file, you have different tabs. You can pin tabs in certain locations if you want. You can close tabs, get rid of all the tabs if you want. Everything is available. All of your files are essentially inside of your project. Your project sits inside your Solution Explorer, which is this right-hand panel here. And so let's just open up that program file again by double-clicking. You can double-click on anything in here. Don't be afraid to close stuff, or even actually you can reorder stuff. So if you've got more than one thing open, you can pull that left and right, reopen them and reorder them. So that's your Solution Explorer and your code window. The other one we'll be looking at today is the error list panel here. So your Visual Studio should look mostly like what this looks like now. The size might be different depending on whether you're using like a big flashy monitor or a small like Ultrabook or something like that. So what you might find is you need to resize some of this stuff to make the area usable. And actually all of the panels in Visual Studio can be dragged and resized. And actually you can move them around as well if you want. But I think for purposes of following along with this series, you should try and keep it as close to standard as possible, which should look very similar to what I have here. I'm actually zooming in with sort of resolution scaling to make everything nice and big and clear. You might find that you've got a lot more space to work with than what I've got here. So that's the code editor window, Solution Explorer on the right where all of your files are, and the error list box at the bottom here. The other part we will be looking at today is actually the start button here. This essentially just starts or runs your program. So let's have a look at this code file that's being created for us. This is called program.cs. That CS on the end just stands for C#. If you were using another programming language, you might find that actually, say, Visual Basic would be a .vb, and JavaScript might be a .js. So all of those types of files could appear here in your project in your Solution Explorer. So the main one that's created for us when we make a console application is program.cs, and it has actually a function called main. And main is the main function of this program. So we have our program, we have our main function, and then we have these squiggly brackets here. Inside of the squiggly brackets is where we do all of our coding for this particular program. So today, the purpose of this program will be to ask the user for their name, to store a copy of their name temporarily, and then to repeat some sort of salutation to the user and include their name, and then wait for the user to exit the program. So to start with, what's very handy actually I find is when you are making a program, it's best to just map out what it is that you want the program to do. So in C# you can put some comments in there, which is essentially just some text in the code file that doesn't do anything. It's just a visual clue about what's going on. So I like to map out exactly what I want to do. So you start that by doing 2 forward slashes, and you might say ask user for name. That's the first thing we want to do. And then the second thing will be wait for user to, I would say, input their name. And then finally, say something nice to the user. And actually, finally say we want to wait for the user to press return before closing. So those are the goals of this application, and we're going to go through one by one and look at how we might do that. But before we do any programming in here, I just want to run this program as is. So remember, there's no code. These are just comments. They don't do anything. So if we press start, the application launches, and it starts at main, and then it executes any jobs in here that it finds, and there isn't any. So then it immediately hits the end of the program. Once the program's ended, obviously the program closes. So what we need to do to avoid that is to put some instructions in here, and at the very least wait or pause for something to happen before ending the program. So let's just go through one by one and look at how we can fulfill these requirements. So we've got our first requirement here. We need to ask the user for a name. So what we want to do is communicate with the console. So we want to say console, which references the console object essentially. And we want to say console dot, which opens up this sort of autocomplete box, and we see all of the things in here that the console object has available for us to play with. There's a lot in here, and you can ignore most of it for now. What we really want to do is we want to write a line. So we say console.writeLine. WriteLine's actually a function. So with a function, we can pass in a parameter. A parameter can be anything we want. For this particular function, I know that its parameter is a string. You might have heard the term string. It's essentially just text. It's just alphanumeric characters or special characters, anything that you would typically consider text. And you'll have seen these in probably every program you've ever used. Anywhere where you see strings, anywhere where you see text underneath in the programming, that is a string stored somewhere. It might be just stored in memory. It could be stored or retrieved from a file, or maybe from the network or a web service, but it's all essentially just strings. So in order to call a function, you have to put in these parentheses. There is actually a nice autocomplete in Visual Studio. So if I put the first one in, it puts the second one in for me. And then in order to type a string into Visual Studio, or in C# really, you need these double inverted commas, and then you put your text inside those double inverted commas, and you know if you've got it right because actually Visual Studio will highlight that text in this sort of orange color. You can change these themes. So when you start Visual Studio for the first time, you'll be asked to pick a theme. I've picked the dark theme here, as I think it's probably the most common one that people want to use. But in the light theme, the colors are a little bit different. Obviously, this background will be white, and the blues are a bit different, and I can't remember whether it's green or blue, but essentially the colors will be a bit different. But when you're dealing with strings, especially in dark mode, you'll see that those are formatted and highlighted in orange for you. So any text that you type into a string will be that orange color. So that's how you know that you're entering a string. So we want to ask the user for a name. So let's just type it in. What is this to say? Hello, stranger. What is your name? And what you probably see here as well is we've got this sort of red squiggly line, which is kind of similar to like word processors, where when you make a spelling mistake, or there's a word that it doesn't understand or isn't in the dictionary, you'll get this sort of red squiggly line. And when you're programming in Visual Studio, this is actually there to help you with coding errors, or what we would call syntax errors, because essentially coding and programming language, it's just a syntax. It's like a set of rules for writing the text in the code, and it has to follow specific rules, or it just won't work. So what we would find, actually, if we try and run this with that error, nothing will happen, because it's such a fundamental, such a basic error that the program just can't even be compiled. It can't even be run by the computer. So we can look in our error list down here and see actually we've got an error, and it'll do a good job a lot of the time explaining what it is you've done wrong. Sometimes it uses very odd terminology for people who aren't programmers, so it can be a bit confusing when you're just getting started. But in this case, it's very simple. So we've got semicolon expected, and that's because in C#, we must always end each line with semicolon. And that tells Visual Studio we are finished with this line of code and we want to end it. So now that we've got our first requirement met, we've got to ask the user for a name. So we write in the console and we ask the user what their name is. We can move on to the next requirement, which is essentially to ask the user to write something into the console. And the way we do that is, again, we communicate with the console and we say console.readLine. So whereas before we wrote a line to the console, we're actually looking to read a line from the console now. And we don't need to pass in any parameters to this one. So we just end that line. But one thing that we do need to do is we need to keep a record of what they type in here. So what we need to do is create something called a variable. And the way we do that is we type in var, which is short for variable, and we give the variable a name. So we'll say this is called user's name. It could actually be called anything. You could think LOL if you want to, but for this particular variable, we're going to name it in a way which later on will be obvious to us. So you can call your variables anything. Lots of people use, var x equals something or var y equals something, which is for very small programs absolutely fine, and I do that all the time. But when you're working on much larger programs, it can get really confusing for you to remember what x is or what y is, especially in like bigger functions. So it's good to get into the habit of naming things in a way which makes it very obvious what they are. So in this case, we're asking the user for the name, and then we're reading what should be their name from the console. So we'll say this variable is called username. So say var username equals, and then we'll assign it the value from the console's readline function. And what readline will do is actually kind of pause your program until the user puts something into the console and hits return. So essentially what we've done here, we said we need a new variable. It's called username. We're assigning it the value that the user enters into the console, and then we're going to pause the program here until the user enters something. So that satisfies our second job. So if we move on to the third job, we then need to say something to the user. We know we want to use their name in this, which is why we've assigned it to a variable. So just like we did before with the console.writeLine, we'll do the same again. Console.writeLine, and then we'll put in our string here in double inverted commas, and we'll say thank you space. And one thing you can do with strings is you can add them together or you can join them. So you can say thank you space, and then we'll add that string onto this username here. So the way we do that is you just say plus, and we can start typing in user. And because Visual Studio knows that we've created this variable up here called username, it'll actually try and help us out. So what you see when you start typing is a bunch of autocomplete suggestions, essentially. And it'll try and find code that's available to us that makes sense based on what we've typed in. So if I type in user, we have hello world user, that's the name of our program, and we have username, which is the variable we created above. So we can actually hit tab here, and it will auto-complete that variable name. And actually what you'll find is as you get better and as you learn more about the different objects that come with the .NET framework, you'll start to just type in like sometimes the first 2, 3, maybe 4 letters of a variable or an object that you want to access, and then you'll just hit tab. And you'll be hitting tab all the time, and it honestly makes you can write code very, very quickly with that type of autocomplete. So it's definitely you really will miss that feature if you ever start trying to write code in something like Notepad. So what we've got at the end here again is we haven't completed the line, so we're going to put our semicolon there. And we're going to say, well, actually no, let's add something else in there. So we're going to say thank you username. Thank you username, and then we'll add another string on the end there, and we'll say have a nice day, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. So that satisfies our third requirement. So let's just recap on what we've done so far. So we've asked the user for their name, we've waited for the user to enter their name into the console, and we've kept a log of it in this variable here. We've then said to the user, thank you username, Have a nice day. Now the final requirement is really just here to stop the program from ending. So just like we did before where we waited for the user's input, we can do the same trick again down here. We can say console.readline. Now we don't need to assign a variable to this particular function call. We don't need to assign the result of this function call to a variable because we're not actually going to do anything with it. As soon as the user presses enter here, we're happy for the program to just reach the end and the program to close. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So we can hit run at the top up here or start. And it says, hello stranger, what is your name? And we will say, Jim does stuff. Hit return. It says, thank you, Jim does stuff. Have a nice day. And the program stays open because we're obviously sitting on this pause here. And if I hit return one more time, and the program ends. So hopefully that wasn't too much all in one go. This is one of the, there's a lot going on here, but it is also a very simple application. Essentially we're communicating with the user's communicating with our program. We're then doing a bit of more communication with the user, but with some context that we pulled in from what they'd said previously. And then we're actually controlling the flow of the application using the readline function to create sort of pause and stop it from closing the application. We've looked at strings, we've looked at creating variables, and we've added strings together. So as lame as this program is, there's actually, these are the building blocks of much larger, more complex programs. And these are things that you really need to master before you move on to tackle something far more complex. But you'd be surprised what you can do with a console application. And in fact, if you go back like 50 years ago, this was how all programs worked. So, black screen, you could enter some commands and the commands would trigger different functions in the background, and there'd be text on the screen, and there was like games and all sorts of stuff built like that. So you can get quite creative with it. It's not something that is super exciting, but it is definitely going to help you build up those skills to start working on more complex programs.